Howdy folks, hope you all had a good weekend, and welcome back to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Now, if all had gone according to plan, as you're sitting there comfortable next to your roaring fire in your slippers with a nice hot mug of cocoa listening to this episode of Mingles with Jingles, I should have been in London on board HMS Belfast attending a press event. As the sharper among you have probably guessed by now, things did not go according to plan, although for once it was my fault, but it wasn't because I'd done anything wrong. See, here's the story. Originally, I was contacted by a marketing agency to ask if I wanted to pop along to HMS Belfast to take part in a press event that I'm not allowed to divulge the details of, but which at the time I was contacted, I was assured that I'd be able to film and record everything and talk about it to my heart's content. A couple of days later, I'm still waiting for a follow-up email. And I thought, just to cover all the bases, I'll get in touch with the people who, not the ones who were organising the thing, the marketing agency were the ones organising everything, but the people who had paid for the marketing agency to organise everything on their behalf. Wargaming. And they said, oh no, please don't talk about this before the event. There's an embargo in place. An embargo that the marketing agency hadn't bothered to make me aware of. So it turned out to be a good idea that I got in touch with the people who were actually writing the checks for this event. So okay, there's an embargo. I'm not allowed to discuss anything prior to the 7th of July. And I'm still not discussing anything prior to the 7th of July, other than the fact that there is a press event on board HMS Belfast on the 5th of July, i.e. today, that I was supposed to be attending, but I'm now not. So anyway, I'll go ahead and book my train tickets, and for me it's not that bad. I don't live that far away from London. It's a 2-hour train journey, and then of course, you know, the time that it takes to get to the train station one end, and then from the train station, again using public transport to actually get to HMS Belfast at the other end, you're probably looking at a 3.5-hour trip there and back. But that's not actually too bad. There are other people coming down from the frozen north who this is going to have to be an overnight journey for them, and that means staying overnight in London, and that shit's expensive, and nobody's paying for any travelling expenses here. This is all coming out of our own pockets. Well, more time goes by, and then it's just a couple of days before the event, and then we all get the news that the actual press event thing, the actual reason why we're going, the announcements that are being made on board HMS Belfast, we're not allowed to record any of it. So in the space of about 2 or 3 weeks, we've gone from 1, would you like to come along to HMS Belfast and cover this press event where we're making a big announcement, to would you like to come along to HMS Belfast, pay hundreds of pounds out of your own pocket for the privilege of getting there and back, cover this press event that we're announcing but you're not allowed to talk about until after the 7th of July, to 3, would you like to pay hundreds of pounds out of your own pocket to come along to HMS Belfast to cover this press event that you're not allowed to talk about until after the 7th of July, to attend a media presentation that you're not actually going to be allowed to record, so there's not really any need for you to be here in person, and we really should have just saved you all the trouble and money and emailed you a media kit 3 weeks ago. And that is why I'm staying comfortable at home instead of travelling 3.5 hours there, 3.5 hours back to attend a press briefing on board HMS Belfast that I'm not actually allowed to record and can't talk about until Thursday. Because I have far better things to do with my time. Unfortunately, that isn't the best part of the story. Because after deciding, screw this, I'm not going to bother going, I tried to get my train tickets refunded. The train tickets, by the way, which I was able to book, pay for and confirm in the space of about 3 minutes without once moving my arse from my mouse or keyboard, but which, in order to refund, are you ready for this? This is unbelievable. So I went to the train company's website and I selected the Manage Your Booking option, and I was able to retrieve my booking, and from there I was given a whole bunch of options, one of which was cancel/claim a refund, and this is what I clicked on. It then told me to wait for an email, which seemed like an unnecessary step, but, you know, fine, whatever. A couple of minutes later and an email arrives, and, well, this is where things start to get faintly ridiculous. The email says, once we receive your tickets, your money will be... Wait, what? Back up. Once we receive your tickets. They're not my tickets. I haven't collected them. They're still your tickets. I would like you to cancel them and refund the money. What's going on here? Let's continue. Once we receive your tickets, your money will be credited back to the account used to pay for the ticket. This transfer is normally completed within 5 working days, blah, 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 blah. To complete your refund, here's where it gets good. Collect all of the tickets for your booking, sending back only the relevant tickets along with a printed copy of this email to the following address. We recommend using Royal Mail signed for delivery. What? Wait, what? These tickets don't actually exist yet. These are Schrodinger's tickets. Until you commit to the actual act of going to the train station, which I don't want to do because I'm not going anywhere, going to the ticket collection machine, which I don't want to do because I'm not going anywhere, and pressing the print ticket button, which you get the idea. The tickets don't actually exist. So, in order to cancel these tickets, which don't actually exist yet because I'm not undertaking a journey with them, I have to undertake a journey and go to the train station and make these tickets exist. I can't help but feel that the train company is adding a whole bunch of unnecessary steps to this transaction. Don't forget, then I have to go back home and then post the tickets back to the train station. How about you just cancel the tickets? I mean, I made the tickets exist in theory without ever having to move my arse from the safety and comfort of my computer desk chair. How about you just forget that it happened and give me the money back? Why do I have to go to the train station, print the tickets, go back home, stick them in an envelope with a copy of the unnecessary email that you sent me, take them to the post office, post them? I mean, who posts stuff anymore? The tickets were created electronically, cancel them electronically. I can't help but feel that it's no coincidence whatsoever that the ticket issuer makes it as simple as possible for you to give money to them and as difficult as humanly possible for them to give money back to you. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but I think I might be onto something here. Well, anyway, moving on swiftly. Do you recall in last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, I spent pretty much, well, almost all of the episode talking about the latest PR dumpster fire in World of Warships as a result of the utter mishandling of the HMCS Yukon premium ship development process? I'm not going to rehash the details. I think it's been talked to death at the moment. But a number of people pointed out in the comments, and I've had some experience of this sort of thing myself, that because of the way projects tend to get handled in a company that has a sufficient level of bureaucracy, it's not really surprising at all that things worked out the way they did. And anybody who's ever had the misfortune of coming up with a business proposal in a company that employs more than a couple of hundred people will probably know exactly what we're all talking about here, but here's roughly how it goes. Somebody who actually works for a living comes up with an idea. They think it's a good idea, they take it to their team leader. The team leader either doesn't care or thinks it's a good enough idea that they're persuaded to send it further up the line to middle management, or at least the first layer of middle management. The team leader might make some notes and additions, but they probably won't mess around with it too much, because they, A, personally know the team member who came up with the idea, and B, they've got enough stuff of their own to do as well as leading the team, so they're usually too busy to want to add anything to one of their team's work, so it just gets sent straight to the first layer of middle management. Once it gets there, however, the situation is different. The middle manager will probably have experience of actually working on projects, just enough experience to be dangerous. They didn't get promoted to middle management by being good at working on projects. It has long been my experience that there are 3 different kinds of people working at the coalface in a business. You've got the people who are not actually very good at their jobs, but just good enough to not get fired. These are the people that just coast along doing the bare minimum. They're never going to get promoted, but they don't care because they don't want to get promoted, they just want a paycheck. Then you've got the second type of person working at the sharp end in any kind of business. And that's the person who is actually pretty good at their job, and they do care about what they do. Unfortunately, this is by far the worst position to be in. There is a myth going around that if you're good at your job, you'll get promoted. Most of the time this is absolutely not true. The only thing that happens if you're good at your job is you get given more work to do. You have to take up the slack from all of the other people who aren't good at their job, and they're only turning up for the paycheck. It's like they say, don't be the best person around at digging ditches. They won't put you in charge of the ditch digging detail, they'll just give you a bigger shovel. And I know this from personal experience. You see, back when I was in the Navy, one of the duties that you had to do whenever it was your turn to do a duty was reaction force, or RF. Basically, if the shit hit the fan, the general alarm would sound. Anybody who was not a member of that day's reaction force would get under cover and get below decks. Anybody who was a member of that day's duty watch reaction force would run to the RF lockers, be issued a rifle which had been pre-sighted for you that morning at the duty watch muster by the duty petty officer, and you'd then disperse to your pre-designated positions on the upper deck. The only qualification required for being nominated as a member of the reaction force in that day's duty watch was that you were in date for your annual personal weapons test. And qualifying for this in the Navy was not that difficult. Once a year, everybody would have to troop down to the firing range, 300-metre firing range, fire 55 shots, and I can't remember the exact qualification, but it wasn't much. It was like 25 out of 55 shots on target. I mean, if that sounds pretty bad, it was pretty bad, but we're the Navy, we're not the Army. We don't take personal shooting that seriously. The standards were not high, they just had to be good enough to probably hit something less than 300 metres away most of the time. But of course, there were still people who somehow managed to fail. I never failed, ever, not once, throughout 22 years of shooting under all circumstances in the Navy. I was actually a qualified marksman. I enjoyed shooting, I was good at it. But despite the appallingly low standard required to pass, there were still people who somehow managed to fail. There were always going to be people who were just naturally terrible shots. But there were also quite a few people who were failing on purpose. And the reason why they were failing on purpose was because, depending on the department that you belonged to at the time, when I realised people were failing on purpose, I was a radio operator, and the duty radio operator was also a member of the reaction force, which meant that if a person in the communications department was not qualified to be a reaction force member, then they couldn't be duty radio operator, or in other words, they never had to keep any duties. They never had to take part in a duty watch. They never had to do their fair share of work. Anytime the ship was alongside somewhere, they could never do duties, so they could go ashore every night. And I couldn't. I, and the others like me who were qualified, had to keep more than our fair share of duties to cover for all the scumbags who were shirking their fair responsibilities. They were the first person involved in working at the sharp end of a business, the ones who just coast through with the bare minimum of effort, just to collect the paycheck, doing just enough to get by, but nowhere near what they should have been doing. Now, you might be thinking, well, how can that be right? I mean, surely there were checks and measures in places to prevent this, and yeah, you're right, on paper there were. Technically, on paper, you could be discharged from the Navy for failing to complete your annual personal weapons test, but realistically, it never happened. Ever. Nobody has ever been discharged from the Royal Navy for failing to complete an annual personal weapons test, because the Navy spends tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of pounds training people, and they're not going to throw them out just because they can't shoot straight. It's the Navy, it's not the Army. Who cares? Well, I cared. You get into Barbados for 5 days. There are 7 of you in the department. There are 5 duties that have to be covered. Why am I doing 2 of the duties? Oh, that's right, because you 3 can't do duties because you can't shoot straight. Oh, and this is the best part. Funny story. After about a year of this on one ship in particular, where I was really starting to get pissed off, I thought to myself, what would happen if nobody was qualified? They might have to do something then. So on my next annual personal weapon test, I went along to the range and I made sure that I was next to one of these scumbags who kept failing. And remember, I was a qualified marksman, and I deliberately put more than half of my shots into his target, so he was guaranteed to get a pass, and I would get a fail, and I wouldn't be able to keep duties. Do you know what happened? He got a pass. He was now qualified. He had to keep duties. He was not happy about it. That's the good news. The bad news is I got a pass as well. What? I knew for a fact that I'd only put 20 shots into my target, which was well below a passing grade, so afterwards I went to the petty officer gunner in charge of the range firings and said, so about my score? And he said, yeah, look, we know you're a good shot. We figured you were just having a bad day, so we gave you a pass anyway. Yeah. Anyway, I said there were three different types of people who work at the sharp end of a business. So, the scumbags who just coast along doing the bare minimum necessary, the people who were actually good at doing what they did and enjoyed it, and who therefore usually just get given more than their fair share of work to do. And then you've got the third type of person, and this is the type of person who usually is the one that actually gets promoted to team leader or middle management. And they're the type of person who may be good at their job, but just as likely might not be good at their job. But they will be very good at looking as if they know what they're doing, kissing an awful lot of arse, and also giving the impression that they would be good at leading projects. And you don't actually have to be any good at doing the job in order to lead people who are doing the jobs. A couple of the best middle managers that I ever had were an Army Staff Sergeant and a Royal Air Force Flight Lieutenant, neither of whom had the slightest clue what it was that I actually did for a living. And they didn't care. As long as the job got done and nobody was complaining about the work that was being done, they were happy. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, particularly in the civilian marketplace, the people who get promoted to middle management have gotten promoted from being the workers. Now they're not doing the actual work anymore, they're managing the people who do the work. But they still have ambitions. They don't want to be middle managers forever. And because most of them got promoted from the ranks of the people who were doing the work, they know enough about the work to just be dangerous. Hands up anybody who's familiar with this situation. So you're working in a department for a business or whatever, and things have been going well, nobody's complaining, you're meeting all your targets, everybody's happy. And then your middle manager either retires or gets promoted or gets fired or moves to another company, whatever. Now you're in the situation of having a new middle manager come in. Now remember, your department has been achieving its targets, it's been meeting its deadlines, nobody's been complaining about what your department does or how it does it. The new middle manager immediately changes everything. Yeah? Anybody been in this situation? Nothing was broken, the new boss immediately starts fixing everything. Now this isn't the same as somebody being brought in to save a failing department. Remember, your department was working just fine. Nobody was complaining, all of your targets and deadlines were being met. But the new boss comes in and he immediately starts fixing stuff that isn't broken. This is a classic sign of a kiss-arse desperately trying to impress their new bosses. Middle managers don't want to be middle managers forever. They want to get promoted. So when your proposal makes it up from you, through your team leader, to the first layer of middle management, it's now in the hands of somebody who doesn't have any real idea of what it is that you do for a living on a day-to-day basis, but has some experience of what your job entails and therefore has enough knowledge to be dangerous. An awful lot of middle managers were never really any good at doing whatever it was that you do for a living, but they were very, very good at making it look like they were good at what you do for a living, exceptionally talented when it comes to kissing arse, and can't resist the urge to fix things that aren't broken so they can turn around to their bosses and say, look how I improved the business, and now your proposal is in their hands. Your proposal is now an opportunity for them to further ingratiate themselves with their own superiors by A, justifying their existence, B, tinkering with your proposal, a bit like a dog pissing on anything upright so they can lay claim to it. And they have just enough knowledge of what you do for them to be able to successfully do that, but not necessarily in a good way. But that's not important. What's important is that your project now has their stamp of authority on it and gets passed further up the feeding chain to their bosses, and this process repeats itself all the way to the top. The further up the food chain this goes, the more managers with no real current experience of anything project related or any real idea of what the project is will have stamped their own ideas onto the proposal in an effort to justify their jobs and make it look to their own bosses as if they actually work for a living. By the time your proposal makes it back down to you, the person who started it, if it ever does, it's almost completely unrecognisable as the proposal that you wrote. But hey, your proposal got approved, so get on with it. Bearing all of this in mind, is it really surprising that the project that Little White Mouse and Chibitsu started for what would eventually become HMCS Yukon bore absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to the proposals that they made. I don't think so. Anyway, moving along swiftly, there are a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, and one of them is, well, I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos lately from a guy called Josh Strife Hayes. He bears an uncanny resemblance to Rob Stark, and he does a lot of videos about MMOs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. I watched a video where he's talking about the world of MMO whales, and it was fascinating. For those of you who don't know what a whale is somebody who, usually in free-to-play games, spends a ridiculous amount of money. To put that into a context that most of you watching might understand, you probably understand a whale as being somebody who, for example, bought the USS Puerto Rico from the dockyard. You know, that sort of thing. But dropping $100 or so on the USS Puerto Rico from the dockyard because the actual physical grind to get it was impossible isn't really whaling. I mean, it is, but it's definitely at the lower end of the whale population. In other free-to-play games, where there is a very, very heavy pay-to-win aspect, the amount of money that whales are prepared to spend is absolutely ridiculous. So Josh mentioned in his video the world of MMO whales. I'll put a link in the video description. This mathematical principle, it's called the Pareto Principle. I'm probably mispronouncing it. But it's to do with the relationship between the numbers 80 and 20. And you might have heard something like this before. You may have heard that for business sales, 20% of a company's customers are responsible for 80% of the sales. 20% of the employees are responsible for 80% of the results. And they're usually the 20% who get paid the least. It works in computer science as well. Microsoft figured out that if you fix the top 20% of the most reported bugs, 80% of the related errors and crashes are eliminated. Or in other words, 20% of the code has 80% of the errors. 80% of a piece of software can be written in 20% of the total allocated time, whereas the hardest 20% of the code takes 80% of the time. You can even see this at home. Look at all the carpets in your house, or if you don't have carpets, just the floor space in your house. You use 20% of that, you actually walk on 20% of that 80% of the time. 80% of it you only walk on 20% of the time. And this, of course, it shouldn't come as any surprise, also applies to the magical, mysterious world of online massively multiplayer games, where 80% of the players don't spend a penny. But 80% of your revenue comes from the 20% who do. And 20% of the 20% who spend money at all are responsible for 80% of the money that the top 20% spend. And this goes on and on and on. A couple of major software houses took this to its logical extreme and figured out that eventually 51% of all of the money that their game made came from 0.15% of the player base. These are the real whales. People who spend unbelievable amounts of money on games. Usually free to play. Also usually pay to win. And there's a reason why you see so many pay-to-win online games that are ostensibly free-to-play, but where spending real money gives you definite advantages in the game. It's because the game publishers have long realised that they need to be catering specifically to this top 20%, because these are the ones who spend the money. This is where all of the revenue comes from, so it really shouldn't be any surprise that they're catering specifically to this top 20%. But what about the other 80%? The 80% of the player base who never, or very, very rarely, spend any money. Do the publishers still need this 80%? Well, they do, but not directly. You see, the publisher doesn't need that 80% because they're not putting any money in, but the publisher needs that 80% to still be there, because if there wasn't a huge mass of free-to-play players for the whales to beat on and stomp down with all of their pay-to-win stuff, then the whales would stop playing and stop spending money on the game, because what's the point in having all of the best stuff if there aren't any freebie players around to crush under your gold-plated jackboot? There is actually a very, very important relationship between the whales and the free-to-play players. The publisher needs them both in order for everything to work, and for the game to remain profitable. But the amount of money that a whale is prepared to put down on a free-to-play game in order to crush the freebies under his jackbooted heel is nothing in comparison to the amount of money that whales will spend when they run into another whale. This is the kind of situation that games publishers have wet dreams about. If they can get a whale to fight another whale, the sky's the limit, and the battle will keep going until one of the whales runs out of money. The only real winner here is the game's publisher. But how do you get whales to fight other whales? I mean, just by the laws of averages, it's going to happen at some point sooner or later, but what if you could manipulate the whales into actively seeking out and getting into fights with the other whales? How could you do that? Because that is the holy grail in games publishing, especially in the mobile market, where the monetization and opportunities for pay to win are absolutely predatory. But we're seeing it in the PC games market as well. That is the holy grail, getting the whales to fight each other. How do you do that? Beyond just leaving it down to luck and hoping that a couple of whales will bump into each other during the normal course of gameplay. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is the reason why games have leaderboards. This is why games have achievements and usually server-wide announcements when somebody is the first one to do something. Whether that's reach level 60, or be the first one to max out a certain skill, or whatever. It's all about the whales. That doesn't mean that the publisher doesn't care about the other 80% of the players. I mean, they do. It's nice to be able to say, we have this many people playing. And as we've already seen, it's important to have somebody in the game for the whales to lord it over and crush. But they're not developing the game for the 80% of the players. They're developing it for the 20% who actually spend money. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in this week's episode was something called NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. Have you ever heard of them? There is a quite frankly hilarious bit of a fuss going on in the digital art world with regards to NFTs at the moment. But before we get to grips with that, you need to understand what an NFT actually is. So, in economics, a fungible token or asset is something with units that can be readily interchanged, like money. You can swap a £10 note for two £5 notes and it still has the same value. But if something is non-fungible, this is not possible. It has unique properties, so it cannot be interchanged with something else. For example, the Mona Lisa. It's a one-of-a-kind. You can take a photograph of it, you can have a print of it, but it's not the Mona Lisa, it's just a copy. Traditional works of art, like the Mona Lisa, cannot be duplicated, not perfectly. They are one of a kind, and this is what gives them their value. But digital art can be duplicated perfectly. So how can digital art have value? Well, apparently the answer, according to a whole bunch of people who really should know better, is to create a non-fungible token for that piece of digital artwork. Essentially, a digital certificate of ownership. The digital certificate of ownership cannot be copied. It is one of a kind. Fairly recently, a digital-only piece of art was sold at Christie's auction house for $69 million. But the winner of the auction didn't actually receive anything other than a token, saying that he'd won the auction and this thing now belonged to them. And the trade in, I mean, if you can call it that, well, it is, because money is changing hands for these things. But the trade in digital art NFTs has been getting ridiculous. A couple of days ago, I headed over to a website called niftygateway.com where they trade in NFTs, and there was one in particular. It didn't have to be this specific one, I just picked an NFT at random. It's called Gucci Ghost Yellow Aqua number 27/45, and it recently changed hands for the moderate sum of $3,600. But this site also allows you to track the sale history of the NFT in question, so you can see that Gucci Ghost Yellow Aqua 2745 was created on the Ethereum blockchain and bought by somebody for $200 on November the 28th of last year. The person who spent $200 on this particular piece of art then listed it for $5,000, then lowered the price to $1,950, then lowered the price to $1,000, And then on February the 8th of this year, it was bought for $1,000. The same day, the person who bought it for $1,000 listed it for $3,600, and then less than a week later, somebody bought it for $3,600, and then a couple of days later put it on sale for, wait for it, $16,300. $16,300 for a piece of art? How can I get me some of that? Well, you can get the art, you just can't get the token that says you own the art, but you can have your own Mona Lisa, identical in every way if you want, in the digital art world. I can't help but feel they'd be cheated. Take care, folks. Catch you next time.